Kritisch Lützeburg. The satirical portrayal of Luxembourg in Guy Reveny's You Had a Voice is Sought as Voice by Cosimo Suglia.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to my bachelor defense. Before I start going deeper into the presentation, I want first and foremost to illustrate my primary source. Your Heart of Vice is Sought as Voice is a collection of small text, flash fiction, and dictionary entries of satirical nature. The book was published in 2016 in Luxembourg by the publishing house Edition Guy Binsfeld. Important to note is that the collection is an English translation, translated by Sandra Schmidt, of 4 prior released German collections by Guy Revenich and the publishing house Edition Phi in the early 2000s. Now, as I already mentioned, these are of satirical nature, and as my title obviously indicates, that is an aspect that was analyzed throughout. And I think now is a good point to transition into my next slide. This slide, I will talk about my working thesis, or rather my research question, which is how does Guy Reveny's Your Heart of Vice, Hot as Vice satirically portray Luxembourg? Obviously, I wanted to illustrate how is Luxembourg satirically presented in the book. Now, I must admit that not much has changed from my initial research question, besides the addition, or rather clarification of the term satirically, which guided me towards a clear path. I had to research and understand satire, and the result of this has become my methodology and framework. However, while doing research, I wanted also to understand the why is Luxembourg portrayed as such, and I stumbled upon the so-called post-war authors movement in Luxembourg, in which Revenich was part of. These were authors active in the 70s and 80s and even until today, and these authors, as Georg Hausenmeier beautifully states, opposed the ungainly patriotism and switched into a critical discussion of the fatherland. This actually helped me quite a lot and ultimately led me to devise my thesis in 3 chapters that represent the main subjects of attack, or rather critique, by Revenich and his peers. It is religion, monarchy, and identity. So, what did the research question do? It ultimately, I was able to delve into other aspects of the portrayal of Luxembourg without being confined into the how alone. It allowed me to broaden my view and look into other aspects of the satirical portrayal of Luxembourg and to understand it. Now, when I come to my primary source, obviously I already presented it as Your Heart of Vice, as Hot as Vice, but I also have a co-text. But first I want to delve into why this translation. Well, I have stumbled upon this book because we worked with it in class, and I was quite fascinated by the recent emergence of English as a literary language in Luxembourg, and therefore decided to ultimately focus on such a topic. Additionally, the size of the text allowed me to analyze various of these texts without it becoming stale, although most have thematic similarities. However, I must mention that I had to do selection and choose texts I subjectively thought were the best for analysis. Therefore, a counter-argument of my thesis could be that the selected texts are not well chosen. So additionally, I choose a co-text for my thesis that helped me quite a lot in understanding the mentioned why aspect of said portrayal. This text by Revenich too is Alte Utopien, neue Aussichten, 4 kleine Thesen zur schriftstellerischen Arbeit in Luxemburg. It was published in 1984 in a collection named Nach Berlin. As I said before, a group of young post-war authors journeyed in 1983 to Berlin as to represent Luxembourgish literature on an international level, and also as to criticize the non-respect they receive in Luxembourg. They argue that Luxembourg's cultural institutions, at the time of course, were compromising their art, which admittedly has been confirmed several times in my research. Reveny's manifesto, as I have permitted myself to name it, talks about the role of literature in Luxembourg and the accomplishment a writer should strive for. He argues that Luxembourg is not a provincial country anymore, although institutions try to keep the population in check by drawing them into a static state of backwardness. The mission of the writer is to oppose control, especially institution-driven. Ultimately, Revenich illustrates the common thought process and ideology within said movement, and therefore this manifesto allows a juxtaposition to the selected text as to better understand their targets and their text. Not only that, but it allowed me also to delve deeper into the ideology of these post-war authors and to understand them better, and also allow me to criticize them to some extent. But it helped a lot in contextualization, especially because it was written by Revenish himself. Now, while my co-text helped me a lot in contextualization and juxtaposition with the ideology of post-war authors, I had to also establish a theoretical framework. Obviously, as I started, I had only a vague idea of satire and could most definitely not precisely define what satire is, and it turns out nor can most people. Satire is a fickle subject that has a lot of interpretations and literature about. However, there are also some established concepts which I was able to utilize in my thesis. First and foremost, I introduced the idea of satire as a mode, distinction that must be made when talking about satire, as I've read several times in various sources. If we talk about satire as a genre, we often mean a structure or form of a traditional Roman Greek poem, as I illustrate here, Horatian or Juvenalian, that can be prose also, like the Menippean structure. However, Revenish's works does not fall into that category, and therefore, albeit illustrating this part, I put it to the side. Now, if we talk about satire as a mode, it is understood as something that can live within a genre. Now, I quoted here Arthur Pollard because I think this sentence illustrates it the best. Satire is not only a chameleon adapting itself to its environment, it is capable of apparent metamorphosis, masquerading by parody in the form it is criticizing. Basically, most of my selected texts are satirical flash fiction or satirical dictionary entries. The genre is flash fiction, the mode is satirical. It becomes an adjective that defines in which thematic direction the genre text will go. The second framework is an analytical framework that helped me in analyzing. It's by Katrin Hume, and it's a subchapter of her paper, Diffuse Satire in Contemporary American Fiction. The subchapter is named Markers of Satire. So what did Hume do? She looked at the common thread of satire and literature and was able to establish 9 definite markers that describe best satire. Obviously, I'm not going to present the 9 markers because it would take too much time, but I condensed them into 3 points. So these critiques or attacks should always contain a sense of humor or wit, as she states, differentiated from hellfire sermonizing. They can't simply be insults, there should be something technical behind it. And then these attacks should be an extreme surreal, but still have a rhetorical nature to it. It must be challenging of a notion and have the subjective moral high ground, and even entice the reader to recognize his own wrongdoings. And lastly, also the satirical attack is always the satirist performance. So when we talk about the satirist, we talk about the public persona he establishes through the text, and not essentially the private person that sits down and writes them. So I have to mention here that although I use this framework, but Hume, the other part of her paper is of no interest for me because she looks at the contemporary American novel that is usually not defined as satirical, but she sees some drops, some what she calls diffused satire in those novels. So these are of no interest. I merely took over her satirical framework. So finally, through the extensive analysis and contextualization I was able to do with the co-text and my framework, I was able to conclusively construct a portrayal of Luxemburg as seen through the collection, while simultaneously positioning the influence of the post-war authors, especially that of Guy Revenish, within this portrayal. Ultimately, the thesis statement I was able to establish is the following. Luxembourg is satirically portrayed as religious, monarchical, institution-driven nation, an image influenced and produced by the left-leaning ideology of the post-war movement, which actively opposed the popular conservative attitude dominant in Luxembourg. Although Revenich's attacks might not necessarily be warranted in the time period in which the English translation has been published, so 2016, but nonetheless, there are past attacks recurrent in the Luxembourgish literary landscape of the 70s, 80s, and early 2000s. Also, I have to admit that Revenich is sometimes really aggressive, although the texts are filled with literary tools and witty wordplay. Some of them are close to being mere insults. There was one especially. What I would suggest for future research maybe is that one could compare Luxembourgish literature and the social context or even the political context of the 80s and that of the modern contemporary Luxembourgish literature of new emerging young talents. I'm actually really happy how it turned out, how my thesis statement turned out. Although I have not written this thesis statement as it is in the thesis, I already reformulated for the sake of this presentation. We most definitely added to the correction, but I think I was really happy about the workflow, about how I worked with this thesis and how I was able to put my Discord into the already existing material and do something I would argue essentially new. Thank you for listening.